February 21st, 1945, third day of the battle. Marine Corporal Hershel Woody Williams crouched in volcanic ash, watching Japanese machine gun fire rip through 3 successive Marine companies attempting to cross an airfield. Behind him sat 8 Sherman tanks, but these weren't ordinary Shermans. Mounted where the 75mm main gun should have been was something the Japanese had never encountered before. A flamethrower capable of throwing napalm 150 yards. 300 gallons of jellied death waiting to be unleashed. The Marines called them Zippos, after the famous lighter. The Japanese would soon have another name for them. The weapon that made men abandon positions they had sworn to defend to the death. This is the story of how 8 experimental tanks, built in secret by Navy construction crews in Hawaii, broke the most formidable defensive fortress ever constructed in the Pacific. And why Japanese soldiers? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today, who had endured months of naval bombardment and aerial attacks without retreating, fled screaming from positions when they saw these machines approach. The mathematics of Iwo Jima were brutal before the flamethrower tanks arrived. 11 miles of tunnels carved into volcanic rock, over 600 concrete pillboxes with walls 4 feet thick, 23,000 Japanese defenders who had spent 8 months transforming an 8-square-mile island into a 3-dimensional fortress designed to inflict maximum American casualties. The preliminary bombardment, 3 days of naval gunfire and aerial bombing, had done almost nothing. The underground positions were immune. The reinforced concrete bunkers could withstand everything except direct hits from battleship guns. When Marines hit the beaches on February 19th, they discovered terrain that turned every tactical advantage against them. The volcanic ash was so fine and loose that men sank to their ankles with every step. Tanks bogged down trying to climb 15-foot terraces. Foxholes collapsed as soon as they were dug, and everywhere, hidden Japanese positions waited. For the first hour, there was silence. Then, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commanding the Japanese garrison, opened fire. Artillery, mortars and machine guns erupted simultaneously from positions across the island. 519 Marines died on the first day. Over 2,400 became casualties. By D+2, February 21st, Marine commanders faced a crisis. Conventional weapons weren't working. Rifle companies attempting to assault pillboxes were cut down before they could get close. Artillery and naval bombardment destroyed some surface positions, but were useless against the tunnel networks. Infantry assaults without specialized weapons resulted in horrific casualties. The Marines had brought flamethrowers. The man-portable M2 units carried on operators' backs. 70 pounds of steel tanks filled with diesel and aviation fuel, connected to a firing wand by rubber hose. 7 seconds of burn time, 20 meters effective range, and a casualty rate that would climb to 92% in 1 Marine battalion. The portable flamethrower was devastatingly effective against Japanese fortifications. It was also the most lethal assignment in Marine Corps history. Every time an operator fired, the brilliant orange flame marked his position for every enemy soldier within sight. Japanese defenders understood that flamethrowers represented their greatest threat. They concentrated fire on operators with desperate intensity. The bright flame acted as a beacon. Once fired, operators became priority targets for machine guns, rifles, and artillery. The weapon's effectiveness was matched only by its danger to those who carried it. But on February 21st, something new arrived on Iwo Jima's beaches. 8 modified Sherman tanks that had been constructed in secret at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii over the previous 3 months. These weren't field improvisations. They were purpose-built flamethrower tanks that replaced the Sherman's main gun with a weapon capable of projecting napalm-thickened fuel at 300 pounds per square inch of pressure. The development of these tanks hadn't begun with military bureaucracy or official procurement channels. It had started with desperation and innovation. The story begins 6 months earlier, in the summer of 1944, when American commanders in the Pacific realized that conventional tactics were insufficient against Japanese defensive fortifications. The battles for Saipan and Tinian had proven that even overwhelming firepower couldn't dislodge defenders who had months to prepare underground positions. Artillery could crater the surface. Naval bombardment could level buildings. But neither could reach Japanese soldiers hidden in caves and tunnel networks carved into volcanic rock. The U.S. Army Chemical Warfare Service had experimented with mechanized flamethrowers mounted on light tanks, crude devices that showed promise but lacked range and fuel capacity. The Marine Corps, witnessing the devastating effectiveness of portable flamethrowers, despite the horrific operator casualties, requested something better, something that could deliver the killing power of flame without exposing vulnerable human operators, something armored, something that could move with tank battalions and deliver punishment directly at the front. In May 1944, a top-secret composite unit assembled at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii. Colonel George F. Unmacht of the U.S. Army Chemical Warfare Service led the operation. A career officer with 4 decades of military experience, Unmacht understood something fundamental about Pacific warfare. Fire and flame would overcome Japanese defenders where conventional weapons failed. He had only the 43rd Chemical Laboratory Company initially. They began by modifying light tanks, M3, Stuarts, mounting portable flamethrowers into bow machine gun positions. The first prototype was christened Satan. It demonstrated its capabilities on April 15, 1944, in front of Army, Navy, and Marine Corps officers. The reaction was immediate. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, known as the father of modern U.S. amphibious warfare, requested 24 Satan tanks on the spot, but the light tank platform had limitations: limited armor protection, insufficient fuel capacity, restricted traverse that limited the flamethrower's arc of fire to 180 degrees. What the Marines needed was a medium tank, a Sherman, with enough armor to survive Japanese anti-tank weapons, with enough internal space for significant fuel capacity, with a flamethrower system that could match or exceed the range of portable units while protecting its operators behind steel armor. The problem was availability. Medium tanks were in short supply. The European theater had priority for Sherman production. Pacific commanders had to make do with what they could find. For Iwo Jima, designated Operation Detachment, Colonel Unmacht's group located 8 M4A3 Sherman medium tanks. Only 8. These would have to be enough. The Seabees, Navy Construction Battalion personnel with mechanical expertise, were brought into the project. 25 men from the 117th Naval Construction Battalion joined Unmacht's team at Schofield Barracks. What followed was an engineering triumph achieved under immense time pressure. The Seabees examined 3 different flamethrower systems: the Canadian Ronson vehicular flamethrower, the Navy Model 1, and the Navy Mark I units, that the Navy had initially deemed unsuitable due to weight and turned over to the Army Chemical Warfare Service. Working sunup to sundown, the Seabees combined the best features of all 3 designs. Machinist's mate First Class A. Reicher and electrician's mate Second Class Joseph Kissel are credited with designing what became known as the CBH-1 flamethrower system. The installation was technically complex. Each tank required 150 pounds of welding rod. 1,100 electrical connections had to be changed. 150 custom-machined parts that couldn't be sourced from standard supply. The modification cost between $20,000 and $25,000 per tank. Adjusted for inflation, that's nearly $300,000 in today's currency, for a weapon system that would see perhaps 30 days of combat. But the capability justified the expense. The CBH-1 flamethrower operated at 300 pounds per square inch of pressure, giving it a range of 400 feet, more than twice the effective range of portable flamethrowers. The weapon could traverse 270 degrees, allowing the tank to engage targets across a wide arc without repositioning the entire vehicle. The fuel capacity was 300 gallons, compared to 4.5 gallons in portable units. Where a Marine flamethrower operator had 7 seconds of burn time, the Sherman flamethrower tank could sustain fire for extended periods, pouring hundreds of gallons of napalm into Japanese positions. The weapon didn't just throw flame. It threw jellied gasoline mixed with diesel oil, a mixture that burned longer and hotter than pure gasoline, that stuck to surfaces and couldn't be easily extinguished, and that consumed oxygen needed for human survival within enclosed spaces. The tactical implications were profound. The Seabees quickly developed an improved version, the CB-H2, with even better range, reaching 150 yards with pinpoint accuracy. But time was critical. The Fleet Marine Force had requested urgent priority for 8 flamethrower tanks to be mounted in M4A3 Shermans, with work completed by November 30, 1944. The actual approved order from Commander-in-Chief Pacific arrived. November 15th, 15 days to complete 8 complex tank modifications. The Seabees delivered on November 30th, exactly on schedule. 2 Seabees, Electrician's Mate 2nd Class Kissel and Shipfitter 1st Class J.T. Patterson, accompanied the tanks to Iwo Jima to oversee maintenance during the battle. Kissel would fill in as an assistant driver and gunner with tank crews for 20 days of the operation, experiencing firsthand what his creation could do. The 8 Zippos tanks landed on Iwo Jima on D-Day, February 19th, along with the initial Marine assault. But they weren't immediately committed to action. The first day focused on securing the beachhead and pushing inland against overwhelming enemy fire. Tank commanders were initially uncertain about the flamethrower tanks' effectiveness. These were experimental weapons, untested in the specific conditions of Iwo Jima's fortress. On D+2, February 21st, they went into action. Sparingly at first, a flamethrower tank would be called forward when rifle companies encountered pillboxes that stopped their advance. The tank would approach under covering fire from infantry, position itself within effective range, and engage. What happened next changed everything. The first Japanese positions hit by Zippo fire didn't just fall silent. They burned. 300 gallons of napalm poured into concrete fortifications at 300 pounds per square inch of pressure created infernos that destroyed everything inside. The heat was so intense it baked occupants alive. The flame consumed all available oxygen, suffocating defenders who might have survived the initial blast. Japanese soldiers who had endured months of American bombardment without retreating fled from positions when they saw the Sherman flamethrowers approach. Word spread rapidly through Marine units. A company pinned down by machine gun fire from multiple pillboxes would call for a Zippo tank. The tank would arrive, methodically, engage each position, and within minutes, sometimes seconds, the resistance would collapse. Infantry could then advance through positions that had cost dozens of casualties to approach. One Marine electrician's mate who operated a flamethrower tank wrote in a letter from Iwo Jima about an incident that captured the weapon's effectiveness. His unit had been assigned to burn out a pocket of Japanese resistance. They accomplished in 6 hours, using 4 loads of fuel, what a tank battalion and 3 infantry companies had been trying to do for 5 days. The infantry, he noted, would sooner see 1 flamethrower tank than a dozen Shermans armed with 75mm guns. The reason was simple. The Zippo tanks could do what conventional weapons couldn't: reach into caves, pour flame into tunnel entrances, eliminate positions that were immune to artillery and small arms fire. Most critically, they could do this without exposing vulnerable infantry to the withering fire that killed flamethrower operators at horrific rates. But the flamethrower tanks faced challenges. The volcanic terrain that hindered Marine infantry also restricted tank movement. Narrow ravines and steep slopes limited where the Zippos could operate. Japanese anti-tank weapons, though less numerous than on other islands, still threatened the Shermans. The fuel consumption was enormous. Each tank burned through 300 gallons in relatively short order, requiring frequent trips back to refueling points. And there were only 8 tanks, spread across 3 Marine divisions assaulting different sectors of the island. Tank commanders quickly realized they couldn't assign the Zippos to specific units. There were too few. Instead, the flamethrower tanks were pooled. They would dispatch from their respective refueling locations as calls came in from units encountering fortified positions. This created a unique tactical situation. Marine rifle companies advancing across Iwo Jima would encounter Japanese strongpoints, call for a Zippo, and then wait, sometimes for hours, holding their positions under fire, taking casualties, waiting for the flamethrower tank to arrive from wherever it had been operating. The dependency became total, As the battle progressed and portable flamethrower operators sustained catastrophic casualties, the Marines relied increasingly on the 8 Zippo tanks. Companies would literally hold up their assaults until a flamethrower tank could be brought forward. The 4th Tank Battalion reported after the battle that the flamethrower was probably the most valuable single weapon employed at Iwo Jima. The commander of the 5th Marine Division stated that events proved the flamethrower tank was the most important single weapon available to his division. These weren't exaggerations. They were recognition of a tactical reality that had emerged through 36 days of the bloodiest fighting in Marine Corps history. Without the Zippo tanks, the Marines would have been forced to rely entirely on portable flamethrowers to eliminate the 600-plus pillboxes and countless cave positions that defended Iwo Jima. Given that one battalion's portable flamethrower operators sustained a 92% casualty rate, the human cost would have been catastrophic. The Japanese reaction to the flamethrower tanks revealed just how terrifying these weapons were. Defenders who had demonstrated suicidal determination in defending positions, who had held out for days or weeks in underground fortifications, despite having no hope of reinforcement or escape, abandoned their posts when Zippo tanks approached. Captured Japanese soldiers later described the terror, the roar of the tank's engine, the distinctive whoosh of pressurized fuel igniting, the orange flame that seemed to reach into every corner of their defensive positions, the heat that turned concrete bunkers into ovens, the suffocating smoke that consumed oxygen faster than they could breathe. Most terrifying was the inevitability. Artillery could be endured by taking shelter deep underground. Aerial bombing, while frightening, often missed tunnel networks entirely. But the flamethrower tanks came right up to their positions. The flame followed them into caves. The napalm stuck to surfaces and kept burning. There was nowhere to hide. Some Japanese soldiers attempted to counter the flamethrower tanks directly. Suicide attackers would charge from tunnels, attempting to place magnetic mines or explosives on the tanks before the flame could engage them. These attacks occasionally succeeded. The Shermans, while heavily armoured, weren't invincible. Japanese defenders had anti-tank guns that could penetrate Sherman armour at close range. Several Zippo tanks were damaged or temporarily disabled during the battle. But the psychological impact far exceeded the physical destruction. Japanese soldiers who witnessed a flamethrower tank burn out a neighbouring position often abandoned their own fortifications preemptively, retreating through tunnel networks to positions farther from the front. This created a cascading effect. As Zippo tanks cleared pillboxes in one sector, Japanese defenders in adjacent sectors would withdraw, creating opportunities for Marine infantry to advance with reduced casualties. The weapon's reputation became its own force multiplier. The daily fuel consumption reached staggering levels. By the end of the battle, the 5th Marine Division tanks were expending between 5,000 and 10,000 gallons of napalm per day. For the entire 36-day campaign, a total of 360,000 gallons of flamethrower mixture was used, combining both tank-mounted and portable units. That's 10,000 gallons daily, on an island measuring just 8 square miles. To put this in perspective, over 30% of all Japanese killed on Iwo Jima were not killed by explosions or bullets, but by being incinerated alive by flamethrowers. The weapon's effectiveness came from its ability to attack Japanese defenders in the one place they had thought themselves safe: underground. The volcanic rock of Iwo Jima could be carved with hand tools in many places. Japanese engineers had taken advantage of this, creating a tunnel network that extended as deep as 75 feet below the surface. Major chambers capable of holding 300 to 400 men served as barracks, command posts, and storage facilities. Smaller caves accommodated only 2 or 3 soldiers as fighting positions. The tunnels connected these positions in an intricate web that allowed troops to move unseen between locations, to reinforce threatened areas, to retreat when positions became untenable, and critically, to reoccupy positions Marines thought they had cleared. This last tactic caused numerous Marine casualties. Rifle companies would assault a pillbox, eliminate the defenders, and move forward. Hours later, Japanese soldiers moving through tunnels would reoccupy the position and open fire on Marines from behind. It happened repeatedly, forcing Marines to clear the same positions multiple times. The flamethrower tanks provided a solution. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. When a Zippo tank poured 300 gallons of napalm into a pillbox or cave entrance, nothing inside survived. The heat didn't just kill through direct burning, it consumed oxygen, creating a vacuum that suffocated anyone in connected tunnel sections. It generated carbon monoxide that spread through ventilation shafts, poisoning defenders who might have been far from the initial flame strike. The positions didn't get reoccupied because there was no one left alive to reoccupy them. On February 23rd, the same day Woody Williams earned his Medal of Honor using a portable flamethrower to eliminate 7 pillboxes single-handedly. The Zippo tanks were operating across multiple sectors of the island. One tank commander described approaching a large cave entrance that 3 rifle companies had failed to reduce over 2 days of fighting. Japanese defenders inside had excellent fields of fire covering the approaches. Any Marine attempting to get close enough for demolition charges or portable flamethrowers would be cut down. The Zippo tank approached from a covered position, using terrain features for protection until it reached effective range. Then it engaged. 300 gallons of napalm poured into the cave entrance over the course of several minutes. The flame created a visible fireball that lit up the surrounding area even in daylight. Smoke poured from multiple openings across the hillside as the fire consumed oxygen throughout the connected tunnel network. When infantry moved in to assess the damage an hour later, they found over 100 Japanese soldiers dead inside, most from suffocation rather than direct burns. The cave system extended over 50 yards into the hillside. Every chamber was filled with smoke and carbon monoxide. Not a single defender had survived. This was the reality of flamethrower tank warfare. The weapon didn't just destroy fortifications, it eliminated every living thing inside, turning Japanese defensive positions into tombs. The Marines had found a weapon that could do what months of bombardment couldn't: reach underground, penetrate fortifications, make Japanese defenders flee or die. But the 8 Zippo tanks, for all their effectiveness, couldn't be everywhere. Iwo Jima's terrain and the scale of Japanese fortifications meant that portable flamethrower operators were still desperately needed, and those operators continued dying at horrific rates. The contrast was stark. Tank crews operating Zippos faced danger from Japanese anti-tank weapons and artillery, but they had armor protection and could retreat if threatened. Portable flamethrower operators had no such protection. 70 pounds of fuel and compressed gas strapped to their backs. 7 seconds of burn time that marked their position with brilliant orange flame visible across the entire battlefield. 0 armor beyond the thick steel of the fuel tanks themselves. The statistics were brutal. For every Zippo tank that eliminated a Japanese position, dozens of positions had to be reduced by Marines on foot, carrying portable flamethrowers, exposing themselves completely. By the battle's end on March 26th, after 36 days of continuous combat, the casualty figures told a story of unprecedented violence. Marine casualties totaled approximately 24,000, of which nearly 7,000 were killed in action, died of wounds, or were missing and presumed dead. This was the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history. It was the only Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties, testament to Kuribayashi's defensive genius and his willingness to sacrifice every man in his command to inflict maximum American losses. Of approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken prisoner. The rest died. Many were incinerated in their positions by flamethrowers. For the flamethrower tanks specifically, the impact assessment was unambiguous. Multiple Marine commanders, from company level to division level, identified the Zippo tanks as the single most effective weapon system on Iwo Jima. Captain Frank C. Caldwell, commanding Company C, 26th Marines, stated flatly that in his view, it was the flame tank more than any other supporting arm that won the battle. This was remarkable considering the other weapons available to Marines: battleship naval gunfire that could throw shells weighing over a ton, artillery battalions with hundreds of guns, close air support from carrier-based aircraft, tank battalions with dozens of conventional Shermans, All of these were important, but in the specific conditions of Iwo Jima, against an enemy who had spent 8 months creating the most formidable defensive position in the Pacific War, the weapon that broke the stalemate was the one that could pour fire into positions where defenders had thought themselves safe. 8 tanks, built in secret in Hawaii over 3 months, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars each, consuming 10,000 gallons of napalm daily. They represented a tiny fraction of American combat power on Iwo Jima, but their psychological and tactical impact was disproportionate to their numbers. The Japanese understood what they faced. Intercepted communications and prisoner interrogations revealed that Japanese commanders had issued specific orders regarding the American flamethrower tanks. Units were instructed to concentrate anti-tank fire on any Sherman that appeared to have a modified gun mount. Suicide squads were organized with the specific mission of destroying flamethrower tanks before they could engage defensive positions. Japanese soldiers were told that stopping the flame tanks was the highest priority, more important than destroying conventional Shermans or targeting infantry. This desperation reflected a fundamental shift in Japanese defensive psychology. For months, Kuribayashi had drilled into his troops that their fortifications were impregnable, that underground positions couldn't be reached by American firepower, that they could inflict casualties far exceeding anything the Americans had experienced in previous Pacific battles. The flamethrower tanks shattered that confidence. Positions that were supposed to be safe became death traps. Tunnels that were supposed to provide protection became ovens that baked defenders alive. The psychological warfare aspect was deliberate. Marine commanders quickly realized that the mere presence of a Zippo tank could break Japanese resistance without firing a shot. In several documented instances, Japanese soldiers abandoned positions when they saw flamethrower tanks approaching, retreating through tunnels before the tanks could engage. The reputation preceded the weapon itself. This created tactical opportunities. Marines would bring a Zippo tank forward to a contested area, position it visibly where Japanese defenders could see it, and wait. Often, within minutes, Japanese soldiers would begin abandoning their positions, filtering out through rear exits in tunnel systems, relocating to positions farther from the flame tanks. Infantry could then advance with significantly reduced casualties, occupying fortifications that might have taken days to reduce through conventional assault. But the flamethrower tanks couldn't operate everywhere. The northern sector of Iwo Jima, with its rough terrain and steep ravines, limited tank mobility. Places like Hill 362 and Turkey Knob, forming what Marines called the meat grinder, required infantry and portable flamethrowers to eliminate Japanese positions one by one. The cost in lives was staggering. The portable flamethrower operators who survived described a specific kind of hell. Unlike tank crews who had armor protection and could coordinate with other tanks for mutual support, portable operators worked essentially alone. They had rifle teams providing covering fire, but the moment they ignited their weapons, they became the primary target for every Japanese soldier who could see them. The flame marked them like a beacon. The whoosh of igniting fuel announced their position. The limitation of 7 seconds total burn time meant they had to make every burst count, but each burst exposed them to counterfire. Marine Corporal Williams, on February 23rd, demonstrated both the effectiveness and the terrible danger of portable flamethrower operations. Over 4 hours, he returned to Marine lines 5 times to refill his tanks and obtain fresh ignition cartridges. 5 times he crawled back into the open under fire to engage more pillboxes. He destroyed 7 major fortifications that had stopped 3 Marine companies. He survived wounds that earned him a Purple Heart. And he demonstrated why flamethrower operators, despite the 92% casualty rate in his battalion, were considered the most valuable specialists on Iwo Jima. Williams' experience highlighted the fundamental difference between tank-mounted and portable flamethrowers. The tanks could approach positions with relative safety, protected by armor, supported by other tanks and infantry. Portable operators had no such protection. They were exposed from the moment they moved forward. The contrast in survival rates was stark. Tank crews operating Zippos sustained casualties comparable to conventional Sherman crews. Dangerous, certainly, but within acceptable military parameters. Portable flamethrower operators died or were wounded at rates approaching total unit destruction. The Marine Corps recognized this disparity. After Iwo Jima, the Fleet Marine Force requested 54 additional mechanized flamethrowers, 9 for each Marine division. The request came before the battle even ended, based on preliminary reports of the Zippo tank's effectiveness. By November 1944, prior to receiving detailed after-action reports from Iwo Jima, the Marines had already identified mechanized flamethrowers as essential for future operations. The planned invasion of Okinawa would receive 54 Ronson-equipped Sherman flamethrower tanks. The planned invasion of Japan itself would require even more. Colonel Unmarked's flame tank group ultimately received orders for 72 additional tanks for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands. His crews had 70 ready by victory over Japan Day. In total, Unmarked's operation produced 354 flamethrower tanks during World War II. The military gave his production operation a AAA procurement priority, the same priority level assigned to the B-29 bomber program and the atomic bomb project. This reflected the weapon's perceived strategic importance. American planners studying casualty rates from Iwo Jima and projecting them onto an invasion of mainland Japan concluded that flamethrower tanks would be absolutely essential. The fortifications on Iwo Jima, extensive as they were, paled in comparison to what Japan itself would present. The home islands had been preparing defensive positions for months, millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians mobilized for defense. Terrain far more complex than a small volcanic island. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 made Operation Downfall unnecessary. But the planning documents reveal the scale of flamethrower tank deployment that was anticipated. Hundreds of Zippos and Satan tanks would have accompanied the invasion forces. The lessons from Iwo Jima had taught American commanders that this was the weapon that could crack Japanese fortifications at acceptable cost in American lives. But for the Marines who fought on Iwo Jima, acceptable cost was a matter of perspective. 24,000 Marine casualties on an 8-square-mile island represented the highest casualty rate per square mile of any battle in American military history. The question naturally arose after the battle, and has been debated by historians ever since: was Iwo Jima worth it? The official justification emphasized 3 factors. First, eliminating the early warning station that allowed Japanese fighters to intercept B-29 bombers en route to Japan. Second, removing Japanese fighters based on Iwo Jima that harassed American bomber formations. Third, establishing emergency landing facilities for damaged B-29s that couldn't make the long flight back to bases in the Marianas. Post-war analysis noted that over 2,200 B-29 bombers made emergency landings on Iwo Jima after the island was secured, potentially saving 24,000 aircrew lives. However, revisionist historians have challenged these numbers, arguing many landings were routine, refueling rather than genuine emergencies, that the strategic value didn't justify the cost. What's undeniable is that the battle shaped American military planning going forward. The horrific casualties convinced planners that invading mainland Japan would be catastrophically expensive. Casualty estimates for Operation Downfall ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American casualties. The ferocity of Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima, where defenders fought virtually to the last man, suggested resistance on the home islands would be even more fanatical. The casualties at Iwo Jima, combined with the even bloodier Battle of Okinawa that followed, helped convince President Truman that using atomic weapons to force Japanese surrender would paradoxically save lives by making invasion unnecessary. For the flamethrower tanks specifically, Iwo Jima validated mechanized flame weapons as a critical component of modern amphibious warfare. The Marine Corps institutionalized the lessons learned. Tank battalions would maintain flamethrower variants as standard equipment. Training programs were established to ensure crews could operate and maintain the systems. Tactical doctrine was developed for employing flame tanks in coordination with infantry and conventional armor. The Seabees' work at Schofield Barracks became the foundation for American mechanized flamethrower development through the Korean War. The tanks used in Korea were direct descendants of the systems developed for Iwo Jima, with incremental improvements but the same basic design philosophy. Armor protection for the fuel and operator, long-range flame projection. Integration with tank battalions for combined arms operations. It wasn't until 1955 that a superior flame-throwing tank design replaced the Shermans the Seabees had created. The legacy extended beyond military technology. The psychological impact of the flamethrower tanks influenced how both American and foreign militaries thought about reducing fortified positions. Soviet, British, and other armies studied the Iwo Jima experience and developed their own mechanized flamethrower programs. The weapon became a standard tool for breaking entrenched defensive positions, from Korea through Vietnam and into modern conflicts. But perhaps the most significant legacy was what the flamethrower tanks revealed about the nature of the Pacific War in its final year. By early 1945, Japan had lost control of the seas and skies. American naval and air superiority was absolute. Japanese defenders on islands like Iwo Jima had no hope of reinforcement or rescue. They knew they would die. Yet they fought with determination that shocked American forces accustomed to enemies who would surrender when further resistance became pointless. The flamethrower tanks were effective precisely because Japanese defenders wouldn't surrender. Conventional siege tactics, surrounding a position and waiting for defenders to give up from lack of food and ammunition, didn't work against soldiers who had accepted death as inevitable. The only way forward was to kill every defender in every fortified position across the entire island. The flamethrower tanks made this possible at reduced cost in American lives. They reached into positions where defenders hid and eliminated them with fire and suffocation. The weapon's inhumanity was its effectiveness. Marine commanders didn't have to like it. Colonel George Unmucht himself noted the irony in a 1948 report, stating it was considered perfectly proper to ruthlessly burn up the enemy, but absolutely inhumane to use gas. The moral weight of using flamethrowers, particularly on the scale employed at Iwo Jima, troubled some participants both during and after the war. Former Marine Commandant and 4th Marine Division Commander, Major General Clifton B. Cates, stated he could not think of a more inhumane weapon than the flamethrower. Marine veteran Eugene Sledge, who served on Peleliu and Okinawa, described his first experience with a flamethrower during training. The heat on his face, the black smoke rushing upward. The thought of turning loose hellfire from a hose as easily as watering a lawn sobered him. The realization of what this weapon did to human beings was difficult to reconcile with the necessity of using it. For the tank crews who operated the Zippos, the experience was different from portable operators but no less psychologically challenging. Tank crews didn't smell burning flesh the way portable operators did. They didn't hear the screams as clearly. The armor and engine noise provided some insulation from the immediate horror of what they were doing. But they saw the results. Blackened cave entrances. Smoke pouring from ventilation shafts. Japanese soldiers attempting to flee burning positions, already engulfed in napalm that stuck to their skin and kept burning. Electricians Mate Second Class Kissel, who accompanied the tanks to Iwo Jima and filled in as a crew member for 20 days, left no detailed personal account of his psychological response to operating the weapon. His technical reports focused on mechanical performance, fuel consumption rates, maintenance requirements. But he had witnessed what 300 gallons of napalm did to human beings trapped in confined spaces. He had seen it dozens of times over 20 days of combat operations. That experience stayed with operators long after the battle ended. The Japanese perspective, reconstructed from prisoner interrogations and post-war interviews with survivors, revealed the terror the flamethrower tanks inspired. Japanese soldiers described the tanks as demons, as instruments of hell that rendered their carefully prepared fortifications useless. One captured officer stated that seeing a flamethrower tank approach was worse than any American bombardment because it meant certain death if they remained in position. Unlike artillery that might miss or bombs that might not penetrate deep enough, the flame tanks came directly to their positions and poured fire inside. There was nowhere to hide in a tunnel system when jellied gasoline was burning at the entrance, consuming oxygen and generating carbon monoxide that spread throughout connected chambers. Some Japanese soldiers chose to flee their positions rather than face the flames, abandoning fortifications they had defended for days or weeks. Others attempted suicide rather than risk being burned alive, and some, trapped with no avenue of escape, died in their positions as the fire consumed them. The survivors, those 216 Japanese prisoners taken from a garrison of over 21,000, almost universally mentioned the flamethrower tanks when questioned about what weapons they feared most. Not the naval bombardment that had seemed so overwhelming, not the artillery or airstrikes, the tanks that breathed fire. The final statistics from Iwo Jima paint a picture of a battle where flamethrowers, both portable and mechanized, had become the decisive weapon system. 360,000 gallons of flamethrower mixture used over 36 days, 10,000 gallons daily at peak consumption. Over 30% of all Japanese casualties caused by flame rather than explosives or bullets. 8 flamethrower tanks, supported by Marine tank battalions across the island. 1 battalion's portable flamethrower operators sustaining 92% casualties. The numbers tell a story of industrial-scale application of fire as a weapon of war, of a tactical situation where the enemy's defensive strategy, hiding underground in fortified positions, made conventional weapons insufficient and required a solution that could reach into those positions and eliminate defenders through heat and suffocation. The flamethrower tanks provided that solution. They broke the stalemate that conventional weapons couldn't. They made positions that were supposed to be impregnable, vulnerable to assault. They forced Japanese defenders to choose between remaining in fortifications that had become death traps or abandoning positions they had sworn to defend. When Iwo Jima was declared secure on March 26, 1945, the 8 Zippos tanks had collectively expended tens of thousands of gallons of napalm. They had destroyed hundreds of fortified positions. They had enabled Marine advances that would have cost thousands of additional casualties if reliant solely on portable flamethrowers and conventional assault tactics. The tank crews had survived at rates far higher than portable flamethrower operators, validating the concept of armored flame projection. The lessons were clear. Mechanized flamethrowers worked. They saved American lives by reducing exposure to enemy fire. They terrified enemy defenders to the point of breaking their will to resist. They would be essential for any future operations against fortified Japanese positions. The 8 tanks built in secret in Hawaii had proven their worth in the most brutal testing ground imaginable. 79 years later, the flamethrower tanks of Iwo Jima remain a controversial subject. Military historians study them as examples of successful weapons innovation under combat conditions. Ethicists debate the morality of weapons designed specifically to burn human beings alive. Veterans who witnessed their use have conflicting memories, acknowledging their effectiveness while struggling with the humanity cost of that effectiveness. The tanks themselves, the 8 Zippos that fought on Iwo Jima, did not survive the war intact. Some were damaged beyond repair during the battle. Others were cannibalized for parts to keep the remaining tanks operational. After Iwo Jima, the survivors were sent to other battles, including Okinawa, where flamethrower tanks again proved essential against Japanese fortifications. By war's end, the original 8 had been dispersed, scrapped, or lost to time. No complete Iwo Jima flamethrower tank exists in museums today, but their legacy endures in military doctrine, in the Medal of Honor citations of men like Woody Williams who used fire as a weapon, in the survivor accounts of Japanese soldiers who fled their positions rather than face the flames, and in the casualty statistics that show what mechanized flamethrowers could accomplish that conventional weapons couldn't. The question that haunted participants then and historians now remains difficult to answer. Was it worth it? Was burning Japanese soldiers alive in their fortifications morally justified by the lives it saved among Marines who would otherwise have had to root them out position by position? Was the battle itself necessary, or could the strategic objectives have been achieved at lower cost through alternative approaches? These questions have no simple answers. What's documented in after-action reports, casualty statistics, and participant testimony is that the flamethrower tanks worked. They broke Japanese defensive positions that conventional weapons couldn't destroy. They enabled Marine advances that would have been impossible or prohibitively expensive in lives without them. They terrified enemy defenders who had shown no inclination to surrender to conventional attacks. And they demonstrated that American industrial capacity and engineering innovation could produce weapons systems that changed the tactical equation even late in the war. The Seabees who built them worked sun-up to sundown under immense time pressure to deliver 8 experimental tanks in 15 days. Colonel Unmucht, who led the program, leveraged every contact and resource to keep his operation funded and prioritized despite military bureaucracy. The tank crews who operated them rolled into some of the most dangerous positions on Iwo Jima and poured fire into Japanese fortifications while under direct enemy fire. The Marines who called for them knew that when a Zippo tank arrived, positions that had been impossible to assault became vulnerable. The Japanese defenders who faced them made a desperate choice: stay in fortifications that had become death traps or flee into the open where Marines could kill them with conventional weapons. Either way, the flame tanks had eliminated the sanctuary that underground positions were supposed to provide. In the end, the flamethrower tanks of Iwo Jima represent a convergence of technology, tactics, and terrible necessity. They were built because portable flamethrower operators were dying at rates approaching total unit casualties. They were used because Japanese defensive fortifications couldn't be reduced by conventional weapons at acceptable cost. They were effective because they exploited the fundamental vulnerability of underground positions, that they required oxygen for human survival, and fire consumes oxygen while generating lethal gases. The 8 tanks couldn't be everywhere. But where they operated, they changed the battle. Fortified positions fell. Marine casualties decreased. Japanese defenders fled or died. The meat grinder of Iwo Jima continued for 36 days, but the presence of the Zippo tanks meant that at least some positions could be reduced without sending waves of Marines into machine gun fire. At least some advances could be made without dozens of casualties per 100 yards gained. At least some Japanese fortifications could be neutralized before they killed more Americans. In the calculus of war, where commanders must weigh the lives of their own troops against the mission objectives, the flamethrower tanks provided a solution that reduced American casualties while accomplishing tactical goals. Whether that justifies the method remains a question each generation must answer for itself. But for the Marines fighting on Iwo Jima in February and March of 1945, watching Japanese machine gun fire cut down their comrades, seeing portable flamethrower operators die at horrific rates, the arrival of a Zippo tank meant hope. It meant a fortified position could be eliminated without another suicidal infantry assault. It meant the advance could continue without waiting for artillery to pound the position for hours. It meant fewer of them would die that day. That was the reality the flamethrower tanks provided. Not a clean or morally simple solution, but an effective one that achieved military objectives at reduced cost in American lives. The 8 Shermans, built in secret in Hawaii, modified by Seabees working around the clock, shipped to Iwo Jima and committed to combat against the most fortified position in the Pacific War, it had fulfilled their purpose. They had cracked bunkers that conventional weapons couldn't destroy. They had broken Japanese defensive positions that were supposed to be impregnable. They had provided Marine infantry with a weapon that could clear the way forward without requiring constant sacrifice of portable flamethrower operators who died at rates that stagger imagination. And in doing so, they had demonstrated that American engineering and tactical innovation could produce solutions even to the most difficult military problems. Problems like how to eliminate 23,000 enemy soldiers who had spent 8 months digging 11 miles of tunnels into volcanic rock and fortifying 600 concrete pillboxes across an 8-square-mile island. The answer, as it turned out, was fire. 360,000 gallons of it, projected from 8 Sherman tanks that had been purpose-built to deliver flame at industrial scale. The flamethrower tanks didn't win Iwo Jima alone. Conventional Shermans, artillery, naval gunfire, air support, and above all the courage of Marine infantry who advanced into withering fire all contributed to victory. But without the Zippo tanks, the battle would have been longer, bloodier, and even more costly than it already was. For that reason, the 8 flamethrower tanks deserve their place in the history of World War II, not as symbols of military glory, but as examples of how technological innovation in response to tactical problems can save lives even in the midst of the most brutal combat. The portable flamethrower operators, who died at 92% casualty rates, proved the weapon's effectiveness against Japanese fortifications. The Zippo tanks proved that same effectiveness could be achieved with armor protection that allowed operators to survive. In the end, that's what made the flamethrower tanks significant. They showed that American military could adapt, innovate, and produce solutions to tactical problems even under combat conditions. 8 experimental tanks built in 15 days by Seabees working around the clock became the most effective weapon system on Iwo Jima, according to Marine commanders who fought there. That transformation from experimental prototype to combat-proven essential weapon happened not in months or years of testing, but in 36 days of the bloodiest fighting in Marine Corps history. The flamethrower tanks of Iwo Jima stand as testament to American engineering, to Seabee ingenuity, to the desperate innovation that total war demands, and to the terrible effectiveness of fire as a weapon against an enemy who refuses to surrender. They cracked the bunkers of Iwo Jima not through overwhelming force, but through exploiting a fundamental vulnerability. Japanese defenders had hidden underground to escape American firepower. The flamethrower tanks brought that fire directly to them, into their tunnels and caves, consuming the oxygen they needed to survive. It was brutally effective. It was psychologically devastating to the enemy. It saved American lives compared to alternative methods, and it raised moral questions that veterans struggled with for the rest of their lives. That complexity, that mixture of tactical necessity and human cost, defines the legacy of the flamethrower tanks that fought on Iwo Jima. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.